Well, let me welcome everyone who's with us. Thank you for your patience, and I think we're all good to go. This is a very exciting event. I got to say, I think this is the very first time we have had someone speak as part of our library events who's been located out of the United States. I mean, this is a monumental moment for us. So, Nichole, thank you for that. This event is part of our One Book, One College program where we're talking about a number of themes. But one of those themes is climate change and how we build communities and how climate change is impacting our globe. And to help us move this conversation forward, I'm so excited to welcome Nichole Murray Broome, who is in Barbados right now in the Atlantic Ocean, and she's going to tell us exactly where that is. For those of us who may not know, our geography might be a little blurry, and I have to admit mine gets a little blurry in the Caribbean, so I will own up to that. Nichole is a public relations expert, but she really has a wide range of work and impact on our world. She works with a number of non-governmental organizations. She's an expert in community development, has participated in different groups that are doing, local agriculture. I mean, all different, really a Renaissance woman who has a wide background. And so I am so grateful, Nichole, for your time. And I'm very excited to hear really from you about the front lines of climate change, feeling the impact of a warming planet. So again, Nichole, thank you so much. I will keep track of the chat room and the Q&A. So for our audience members, if you do have questions, throw them in the chat and we either take them, Nichole, at the end, however you want to do it, or as we go, but I can help field those questions as we move forward. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so very much, Troy. I am so very grateful to have been given this opportunity by Moraine to present to you, a body of students and staff, concerning something that is very, very precious to my heart. And also particularly to be invited to participate in this One Book, One College program. I mean, the topic and the action points and the opportunities to really challenge everyone outside of their comfort zones are phenomenal. And so I really am taking it as a privilege and want to say thank you up front. And I want to jump right into getting on with the topic and how we're going to flow. Today, I want to talk about climate change and how it is carving what I have termed the three creatures of the Caribbean. And this really is a modern day story of societal survival. Before I get into that, I just want to jump into a little bit about myself and then a little bit about the Caribbean, just so that we're all on the same page. And then we'll get right into the topic at hand. So let's get going. Okay, so I'm a selfie queen. I took care of my grandmother for several years before I was no longer able to because I was a very busy young adult. My granny, actually, as we call her in the Caribbean, she passed away last March. And I've actually named a line of products that I manufacture after her because of the monumental difference that she's made in my life. And the Caribbean, if you don't know, is heavily matriarchal. And so mothers and grandmothers take a very special place in our hearts. I'm also a farmer, a registered farmer, and I've just recently gotten married 2 years ago. And so that's a little bit about me. Now, a bit about the Caribbean. I am 100% Caribbean woman. I enjoy everything that you would expect as a cliche Caribbean experience. I enjoy the waves, as you can see in this photograph here. Oh, I just enjoy what's available to me and to us. And so you may be surprised that there's quite a few Caribbean people who haven't been to the beach recently or have not experienced what you would anticipate is a good Caribbean life. But I grew up in the Caribbean where you walk for hours and you pick wild fruit, chase animals around the neighborhood, and you just had fun. That Caribbean no longer exists. And it's that I want to really hone in on today in our conversation. So the Caribbean is a chain of islands stretching from the Florida Panhandle all the way down to South America. There's hundreds of islands, but they're really just divided into about 26 states. This is a very tiny map, I don't know it well, of the Caribbean. Many of you would know the Bahamas, Jamaica, Cuba, you'll know Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, but very few people would know any of the other countries. I'm from Barbados, which is a territory just above South America. We're one of the southernmost islands, but we are the most easterly island in the entire chain. So we have more of the Atlantic Ocean experience than the others, which are considered to be a part of the Caribbean Sea. Okay, so let's get on with a brief history of the Caribbean, and it's important that we lay this foundation so that you will understand the context from which I am bringing this presentation about climate and how it is extremely doing a really good job of starving the creatures of the Caribbean. The Caribbean exists on a very precarious foundation. That foundation is one of colonialism and slavery. Now, the Caribbean initially was populated by indigenous peoples, what we call First Nations people. And they were living in great harmony with nature. And then one day, sailors from Europe arrived and they claimed the territories they found for their monarchs. And so the British, the Portuguese, the French, and the Spanish all brought their many ships down with their supplies and their weapons. And something just short of genocide. And so, with an indigenous population mostly gone, many of which died from diseases that came through with the Europeans, as is the story almost everywhere in the Americas, they were left with a blank slate, island paradises that were full of fertile trees, fertile soil. And what happened after that is that millions of slaves were ferried. Millions of Africans were ferried as slaves to the Caribbean and on to North and Central America and some to South America to work on what was created, which was a plantation economy. Trees were raised for acres and acres, leaving very small patches of woodland. And there, the slaves worked on monocrops, which heavily depleted the soils over the 400 years of slavery, until such time as it was no longer fruitful to do so without having to add to the soil. After slavery was abolished, close to the end of slavery, these monarchical colonists began to bring what we call indentured servants over to the Caribbean to help supplement the loss of slaves. And so we have people who were brought from India, from China, from Scotland and Ireland. Many of them were either political prisoners or just general societal troublemakers, people who had debts to pay off. And they came to work as indentured servants. And we've got a reference on indentured servitude from Wikipedia, which I think is really fantastic if you're able to go over there and take a look. After slavery was abolished, the apprenticeship system was started. And that system brought on something very peculiar. The plantation economy, which then was the planter class and their managers, indentured servants, which were a level above slaves, and the slaves or former slaves. They created a very unique three-tiered social system. Apprenticeship saw slaves becoming educated and working to gain skills that they would not otherwise have had in order for them to contribute to society. Independence came over 100 years after slavery was abolished, and many territories achieved that goal by the mid-1970s. After the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, Caribbean societies struggled to rebuild. And it is this struggle that is most important for us to discuss today because I want us to know specifically how difficult it is for a society that was never formalized to now become something that could stand on its own and compete with societies in the rest of the world. The struggle birthed what I call the three creatures of capitalist plantocracy society. I will talk this monologue for maybe another 10 minutes, so bear with me, and then we will have a more interactive conversation. But this bedrock needs to be laid so that you can understand the discussion that will come afterwards. So here are what I call the three creatures of plantocracy. The first creature is identity, the second creature is vulnerability, and the third creature is indebtedness. The creature of identity is peculiar not just to the Caribbean, but to many parts of the world where the transatlantic slave trade would have had a significant impact. So here we have a cosmopolitan island cosmopolitan of peoples from several regions of the world, all of which retained their identity except the children of African slaves. Why was that? Indentured servants came from India, from China, they maintained their roots. So did the indentured servants from Celtic and the Nordic regions of Europe. They maintained their roots. The white planter class also maintained their roots. Because they were British or Spanish or Portuguese or French, it so happened that they always had an opportunity to travel back and forth to have their children educated on the European mainland and also to build and amass wealth so that their identity remained entrenched. Unfortunately for the children of the African slaves, the identity was erased through the heavy, heavy burden of changing of names, separation of families, and also the change in culture, which expression was not often allowed. That's the issue of identity. What happened is we ended up with a system of segregation that oftentimes was not necessarily intentional, but it was created because of these three tiers of people who generally had little to nothing in common. And so while some island territories had quite violent and aggressive altercations, others remained quiet. Up until today, segregation is not obvious in the Caribbean. Come for your wonderful vacation you'd never know. But what has happened is we've got a society where people create spaces for people like them. And so you'd have places you would expect one set of people to attend, but you wouldn't really anticipate to find others there. It's that quiet, sustained separation of people that fundamentally causes issues with identity. Vulnerabilities. Due to the creation of monocrop plantations and the raising of entire forests, the Caribbean became particularly vulnerable to the changes in climate. Now, where the land was once fertile, we have issues where soils have changed their composition. They crack easily, maybe fully clayed, lacking nutrients. And what's happened over time is that heavy use of fertilizers has become a normal everyday activity. Heavy use of pesticides and herbicides because the weeds always survive. And now we have an issue where the heavy use of pesticides and herbicides are causing additional problems. One territory in the Caribbean, called Guadeloupe, is now a country where nothing can be grown for human consumption. You can research Guadeloupe in time to come, but Guadeloupe became a very important talking point between the 1970s and 1990s because of the heavy use of pesticides and herbicides on their banana plantations. Tests in recent years have shown that even the water in the sea around Guadeloupe is so heavily polluted that they've advised people not to even to swim in. Guadeloupe is now what we would consider like a desolate place where people still live. What a tragedy that the Caribbean, which was once a fertile place, is now so very vulnerable, so heavily dependent on imported fertilizers and pesticides in order for the countries to continue to maintain what small, maybe insignificant type of agriculture that they may have. And I say small and insignificant because most Caribbean countries import up to 80% of the food they consume. And I think that's important for you to know. Up to 80% of the food that we consume is imported. Name it, we bring it. And it's very difficult for people to understand the context of the vulnerability. So I'll put it this way. In order for you to get, let's say, bananas from Mexico, you just get one ship. It comes right up the Caribbean Sea. Maybe it'll come around the Pacific to California. You've got a quick stop, bananas for everyone. For the Caribbean, things get a little bit more complicated. A ship, let's say, leaves Florida. Several countries in the islands have made orders. So let's say they stop at Jamaica first because it's one of the closest. And the ship takes its time to refuel and to bring the produce and everything that we need, materials and so on, down the island chain. By the time that ship reaches St. Lucia, which is just to the northwest of us, that ship has pretty much offloaded almost everything that it has because Barbados is one of the most southern. The cost to get our bananas to Barbados is then much higher than the cost of the other islands because the ship has pretty much run its full course, but Barbados is inconveniently located to the east of the rest of the island chain, and so the effort to get here is much greater. Thus, the cost of living in Barbados is inadvertently much higher than the rest of the island chain. With the changes, now we see additional issues that have added on to vulnerability. We've got erosion, we've got vulnerabilities to natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, volcanoes, many of which we've had this year. And for countries which are into mining and crude oil production, there are other vulnerabilities, with the ocean being impacted with any slight oil spill. I want to take a moment, if you can oblige me, to play a video from YouTube that will show you the issues with Guyana this year with unprecedented flooding, the likes of which they have not seen for many, many years. Just bear with me one moment.
We're here on the Berbice River next to the community of Kokwani, where a number of homes have been flooded by an increase in the water level on the Berbice River, which was exacerbated by heavy rainfall.
Well, so far it's only about 2 weeks now since the water reached up like this. Yes, that's about 2 weeks now since we moved upstairs. And there's my father-in-law house. We moved up there. Yeah. But we're seeking other place to go, higher land. Yeah. Until yesterday, day for yesterday, we went and clean up other place to move out. Go see higher grounds.
Here does be the crossing landing, just like over there. Yes, and more out as be road and so forth.
How long have you been living here?
All my life.
All your life. And has anything like this ever happened before?
Not so high. It happened, yes, but not so high.
So it never come up to here.
Oh.
So here we have a brief look at Guyana in May 2021. After months of unprecedented rainfall, several villages in the interior of Guyana, which is one of the northernmost countries in South America, and we make up a part of the English-speaking Caribbean. Several of those villages were fully underwater. There were some villages which were passable by vehicle before that you now had to enter by boat. Some were completely submerged that you could not even tell a village was there. Why is this important? It's important because the residents, as you may have heard, may not have understood in the video, were saying that this is something they've never seen before. Yes, they have floods annually, and they expect the riverbanks to overflow somewhat, but never to the extent where many people had to pack up and leave their villages, entire villages, because there was no high ground for any of them to stay safely. In another video, a young lady describes an alligator, which never would have reached her house before, was able to swim right up to her house and grab a duck from in her yard. And she described how afraid she was because she'd never had a close encounter with an alligator. It's really important for us to understand just how much the Caribbean has become vulnerable. And after vulnerabilities, we look at debt. Now, one surprising creature of the plantocracy system and colonial life in the Caribbean is debt. Most countries can't afford the model that they have created. Many of the Caribbean countries have what we call social democracies, meaning that citizens like myself are willing to exchange money, heavy taxes, in order for the government to provide social services. And so for many countries, primary and secondary education are free. Some have free tertiary education where you pay nominal fees. Many Caribbean countries also have public health care, subsidized public transportation costs, and other aspects of society like social work and so on that are provided free of cost. Because of this, governments in the Caribbean have huge annual budgets. The thing about the annual budgets is that many of these countries cannot afford to maintain them, but because of the system created, feel obligated to keep it going that way because of this three-tiered social class system that has been maintained over hundreds of years. So many countries, after they realize that their debt to GDP ratio is out of whack, will go to the IMF, the World Bank, OAS, and other entities to provide funding to keep the country going. The challenge with that is that it adds to the already heavy vulnerability that we already face. So we have to find foreign exchange to pay for all of these goods and services that we're importing. We also have to find foreign exchange to repay these loans. And because of that, a pressure is held on the government and the people of the country. For one, do structural adjustments that come along with the requirements from institutions like the International Monetary Fund. Central banking becomes important and regulating funds that come through banks and so on. And so the fees are high. Many Caribbean countries peg their dollar to the US dollar instead of to gold bullion. And so if you sneeze in the US, we catch the cold. And so there is this system that is cycling over and over because we are vulnerable and because we have no choice but to enter into debt. The challenge with the debt is countries borrow billions, which they're not able to repay in decades. So countries that borrow in 2021 know full well that their grandchildren and great grandchildren will still be repaying those loans to these entities. And it creates for a sense of social discomfort because everyone's a little bit walking on edge all the time. Because the concern is we don't have many natural resources. We're heavily dependent on services such as tourism or mining. Where's the money going to come from if things go south? Now, to the core of our discussion, and I will be willing for us to have open discussion after these next two slides. Let's look at what climate has done to carve the three creatures of the Caribbean. Imagine a place where hell has already broken loose twice before due to human action and then acts of God, as insurance companies call them. Then for the climate to change. I don't know how many of you trust the thermometer in your vehicle when you get it. But we in the Caribbean can't even trust our thermometers. When you get into the car and it says 37 degrees or 36 degrees Celsius, you're asking yourself, is this for real? 20 years ago, you would never see that. Maybe 28, 29, 30, 31 max. Yet, our meteorological offices and our weather presenters will come at night and say, oh, the maximum temperature was 30.5 degrees Celsius here in Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. Meanwhile, we're all boiling like eggs, looking at the thermometers in our cars and saying, something's wrong here. The two don't add up. But the Caribbean will be slow to admit that the climate has changed so much that people are dying from heat stroke and other things will go undocumented because it doesn't feed well into that narrative that everybody knows. The climate has changed to the point where we no longer know when to expect a hurricane. We have a set hurricane season, which runs from June to November. But surprisingly, the times when you least expect a hurricane, that's when they slam us. We've been getting increased earthquake and tectonic activity, volcanoes, which we thought, oh, none will come in a hurry. The Caribbean had a significant one this year with the Last of Prayer volcano in St. Vincent erupting. Something odd happened, which I think is key for you to understand how the climate has changed. Because Barbados is to the east of the rest of the island chain, pretty much nothing that happens there affects us environmentally. But strangely enough, when this volcano erupted, the wind patterns had changed. The volcano reached so high into the atmosphere, the ash plume reached so high into the atmosphere that it blew backwards, and Barbados became blanketed with volcano ash for the second time in its history. The first time I'm told it was minor, or 60 years ago. This time we had close to 1 foot of ash in some districts. We had to close our houses for up to 2 weeks so that we didn't have to inhale the toxic sulfur gases. We spent months cleaning around our homes, something we never thought we could sell to someone. We actually experienced a volcano. We don't even have a volcano here. It was the strangest thing, and it happened because climate is changing. Something else that's not much talked about is the death of the marine life. Barbados has a problem. We quickly had to create what they call the Folkestone Reserve Marine Park because the reefs were dying due to changes in the way we treat our wastewater, due to the impact of the climate changing and the seas warming. A lot of our corals began to die. A lot of fish swam away. Literally, our national fish is the flying fish. But all of the flying fish 15 years ago decided they no longer wanted to live here. And most of them swam down to Trinidad and Tobago in the south, and they stayed. We went for many years without having a good catch of flying fish, And many of our fishermen got into serious trouble, some even arrested in Trinidad for illegally entering their waters, trying desperately to capture our national fish so that people can be satisfied with their Sunday meals. Climate change has really affected us in the Caribbean. We have recent climate driven terms such as sustainability and resilience, the green economy, and more recently, in the last 2 years, the blue economy. And the blue economy is one that I want to focus on just for 2 minutes. The blue economy is considering that most small islands depend heavily on the sea for our livelihood. Barbados, for instance, 400 times land space is our water space. Our island is just 166 square miles. We have 400 times more space in the ocean than we do have in the land. That means that we are heavily dependent on the water to stay where it belongs and not to flood the coast. We are desperate to make sure that our coasts don't erode simply because it means that the islands will be getting smaller. And we are desperate to make sure that marine life is maintained as we heavily depend on the fishing industry for survival. Now we open up the conversation for us to have about solutions. I'll be presenting several solutions that I've personally been involved in over the years, and I want to invite you to ask any questions you may have and invite Troy to interrupt at any point so that the questions can be presented and I can answer them. Now, the Caribbean is one of the most unique places you have ever found. Languages vary, customs vary from community to community. Some countries, which were ruled by British, French, Spanish, have a totally different Creole to the ones like Barbados, which the British enjoyed monarchical rule over for the entire duration of the colonial era. And so there are differences in language, in culture, in custom, and behavior, each island carrying its own identity. In the 1970s, however, the newly elected prime ministers and presidents determined that they would form something called the Caribbean. We call it CARICOM. And the purpose of the Caribbean community is for the islands to come together with a unified voice to present their case to the wider world. For survival, economically, socially, and also to manage issues that are common to us, including debt. Now, imagine a region separated by the ocean. It's not like the US where, Illinois is just next to Wisconsin, Michigan, and there's Minnesota just above, so that you're able to move. The challenge we have in the Caribbean, because of the changing climate, that we have nowhere to run. We don't grow much of our own food. Only two territories in the Caribbean are known to be fully self-sufficient where food is concerned. So we're dependent on food to come in. We're dependent on the heavens to protect us every year because we're never sure if we'll get some. So imagine you can run from Illinois, you can jump in your car if there's a tornado warning and you can speed out of there. But in the Caribbean, there's really nowhere to go. If there's a hurricane, it will affect the land, it will affect the sea. We're pretty much trapped in a cycle that makes us aware of just how vulnerable we are. Where the solutions come get really exciting because climate change is destroying three creatures that we would have loved to die in the first place on their own. But because of a lack of political will, cultural custom, and a relative comfort zone created, that's the way it's always been, and perhaps that's the way it always will be. Climate has come to say, oh no, whether or not you like it, this has to change. And perhaps this perspective on climate change destroying things that needed to be destroyed in the first place. Maybe the first time you hear climate change discussed from this perspective. Our solutions are varied in the Caribbean. Governments have taken on the task of re-educating the population. Why re-educating us? Because of that three-tiered system created by the plantocracy society. It would be important for you to know that the children of slaves were educated in different ways than the children of the planter class and the indigenous servants. So here's what happened. The planter class, all Europeans, would send their sons back to Europe to get an education. Most of their daughters would become housewives. Their families maintained their wealth and perhaps some grew in wealth. And so their social and economic and educational exploits were advancing exponentially. The indentured servants, they were working to repay debts. And so when the time came for their debt to be cleared, they were either given a portion of land or opportunities to begin merchandising. So many of the descendants of indentured servants became the merchant class. They had private education, and so they were able to learn in ways that perhaps the children of the plant class wouldn't have learned, but definitely the children of the slaves could not learn. During slavery, education was outlawed. Slaves were not allowed to learn standard English. They were not allowed to read because it was feared that the slaves would now begin to read anti-slavery documentation and that they would be upgraded. So at the end of transatlantic slave trade, with emancipation came a charter from Britain. And that charter said, we're going to give your governments money to start educating the children of slaves and the ex-slaves, but we have some conditions. And I stood in the National Museum of Barbados several years back with tears in my eyes to read this charter, which pretty much said that they will be willing to educate the children of the slaves. However, they will educate them to know their place, have a role to maintain the order and the system that was created that benefited the British monarchy. Understand then that the education that the children of slaves receive teach them morals, how to be manly, how to be subservient, how to follow rules, never how to be innovative, never how to start their own businesses. It always has been the same. And that education system has never changed until the last. Why has it changed? Urgency for the Caribbean to educate its people in different disciplines to protect the very countries that are threatened by the climate, that are threatened by new threats that were not considered before. Cybercrime. One big one is the drug trade. Inability for the police forces to handle all of the secrets and manage all of the data that before was swirling around us. Now there came a need for us to educate our people in different ways. And so re-education may not seem a traditional route, but really has been important for the Caribbean to combat climate change and also as they combat climate change to allow those three creatures of plantocracy to die a natural death. If you have questions, please feel free to ask. Another type of solution, and one which I know would be very, very familiar to those of you who have been reading through your one work experience, is community intervention. I have personally been involved in several not-for-profits over the years. One that I am extremely proud of was participating in the Caribbean Congress of Community Practitioners. The methods used in this organization were unorthodox to say the least. We used what we called a grassroots methodology. to reach out to the younger generation, recognizing that many children in poor or underprivileged communities would never have access to opportunities to see, meet, or interact with people outside of their regular day-to-day circle. Created a sporting tournament called the Caribbean Children's Charity Soccer Classic. And for several years, we ran that soccer tournament from island to island, inviting clubs and the National Football Association and private sponsors to sponsor teams from their country to participate in the annual tournament. We were very proud that participation was always high. At times, we had up to 20 teams from different islands in Southern Caribbean, Northern Caribbean as well. And what happened? Children who probably never have an opportunity to travel in an airplane with a passport were able to have an opportunity to do so. To meet children from other islands and off the field form friendships. Because these children were from vulnerable communities, I'm talking about what we would call slums, what you would call ghettos, what you would call poor neighborhoods. These children were now able to see that their lives in their community were limited to their location. And while other children were also struggling with issues of poverty and lack of access, they were able to now see that there's hope apart from what they experience. That if they're willing to study, to work hard, to maintain friendships, and perhaps to see that there's something more than hanging out on the block or the street corners or getting involved in crime because of the financial system that they were raised out. Several of those teams produced national football players. Not only that, one team whose practice we adopted as a best practice was a step-by-step football academy that is today. They had a phenomenal intervention program for their team members. Students and team members were expected to maintain a certain grade average at school. They were expected to bring their report cards to the club at the end of every school term or semester. And those report cards determined whether or not they were able to participate fully in the sports programs or to be assigned to the A team or the B squad or maybe the C squad or maybe benched for the duration of the season. Coaches were intimately involved with making sure that students did their homework and they provided safe space for them to do that and had very good relationships with parents so that when students were not behaving well or their players were not behaving well or were getting into trouble, perhaps falling into the hands of gangs, they would intervene to make sure that these boys and girls would do well. That step-by-step academy of football created national players, some of who traveled to play for other teams, doctors, lawyers, police officers, soldiers, and many of these young men and women go back to the club to give back because they recognize that the intervention that they experienced there is what made the difference in them getting out of the lower tier of society. One may say what's wrong with being in the lower tier, like we explained before with the plantocracy system. If you're stuck with the public education, you're going to get more of the same. But if you're able to have someone to intervene, to allow you space to learn and to grow, then perhaps you can be one of the ones that makes it past the stereotype into a better. And so we've adopted that best practice methodology and we encourage every group, community group around the world to do the same so that you're not just doing something that's outright economic, but at the community level, you're touching people one by one to make sure that they have a fighting chance. We've also had different types of communities. I have led a team to Guyana in South America, and we've actually adopted a village in the interior of Guyana, which is just about an hour drive away from Brazil. When I first interacted with this village. It was actually through the action of a political candidate in that country who came to a conference that the same Caribbean Congress of Community Practitioners was holding here in Barbados. And as he spoke about the challenges that the indigenous community were experiencing, we were all moved. I think I was the most moved of all. He mentioned how children still were not wearing shoes and how many of the villagers were dependent on 5,000 US dollar grant per annum in order to keep the village running. My mind was blown. How can 500 people minimum survive on 5,000 US dollars per year? I couldn't understand it, and I was driven to find out more about how people are surviving in indigenous communities and in villages with such repressive circumstances. And so I was moved to do something that brought the Caribbean together as best we could. I reached out to people from the diaspora. We had a program called Prepared, and the aim of Prepared was for one family to provide one pair of shoes to one child in the village. And so we recognized there were over 200 children in the village. So we settled on this mass campaign across Barbados and the Southern Caribbean to get people on board to donate one pair of shoes. So while they were shopping for school shoes for their own families, they would contribute one pair of shoes. The response was overwhelming. So much so that we had to pack one huge flight to ship down to Guyana. I mean, corporate entities, jewelry stores, manufacturing companies, and families who are living regular lives all made the effort to contribute. When we arrived in the village, it was mind blowing. There was no road. Literally, you had to know where you were going in order to get there. There was no cell phone tower. There was no electricity poles or underground cables. The way of life that I met was a culture shock for me. And Guyana is just 2 hours away from Barbados. What I found there was a strategy that the indigenous people have used for generations to survive. We call it subsistence living, but what they call it is just living in community, something that the rest of the Caribbean will no longer be familiar with because we no longer had nature to interact with. Remember, most of the islands were raised flat into plantations to provide monocrops. And so we don't know what it means to have to deal with wildlife, rivers flowing, and different types of plants. And it just was so foreign. And their way of life taught me that order that is being created in the world to make everyone the same and similar perhaps has done more to fuel climate change than to slow it down. What do I mean by that? We have a heavy dependence on consumerism. We buy, we discard. We throw away when perhaps it's not bad anymore, but we just don't want it anymore because we've been presented with something that we're told is better. Things are different in these indigenous where they appreciate the nature that's around them and they try to live in concert. And I think that's one of the strongest interventions that we at this stage can have for the Caribbean and for the wider world to survive the changes, the climate. How do we dance with nature when it rains for 5 months non-stop and your village disappears? How do we dance when the floods stop, the waters recede, but the waters have brought with them new life, new challenges, new threats? How do we dance? How do you manage when you lose all of your sheep and goats because they can't survive being stuck in moist conditions for more than a day or two? That dance that I observed and was a part of taught me that regardless of the pressures we face to fit in, to have the latest model of whatever device, to make sure that our homes are fitted with the finest of whatever is available, may perhaps become more of a threat to our own survival in the long run than it is for us to say maybe less is better. Along with these community interventions, I've been a part of several different projects and programs that we really felt have had a meaningful impact on the Caribbean. I created the Sustainable Caribbean Grassroots Business Alliance, which simply brings the businesses of micro business operators together so that we can come up with solutions to the challenges that we face. And the greatest challenges we have are that of access to material because we're importing most of everything. We have issues with shipping, with what's the term? It just lost it. The value chain. So where we source our products, how do we get it? When the shipping industry is going to a halt because oil is scarce, and we're hearing about ships being stuck in the harbors around the west coast of America and in the UK. Then we're concerned because now how are we going to get the bottles to package the products that we're manufacturing? How are we going to get the boxes? Since we don't manufacture much of anything in the Caribbean, if something halts in Europe, it stops in the Caribbean. And a temporary closure, even COVID has shown us, temporary breakdown of a ship in the Suez Canal over in the Far East caused entire industries to suffer, entire businesses to die in the Caribbean because they just could not get the supplies that they needed to keep businesses going. And so what have we done? We've done trade missions to other Caribbean countries to showcase what we have to offer and to find out what they also have to offer so that we don't need to go outside of the Caribbean to maybe source small but important things that we need to cause our businesses to thrive. We've also held symposiums and other activities that would help people to learn more, not just about their craft, but about other people's businesses so that they can make better informed business forward. And one final solution I want to mention is clustering. We've done a good job of bringing different people from different industries together, clusters. This means, unlike a cooperative where you may have all farmers or maybe all really good craftsmen working together to create awesome furniture or maybe agricultural products at lower costs, here we have a cluster which may bring together an electrician with a business development expert, with a communications expert, with a farmer, and perhaps with someone who's in the public service. That cluster now forces each member to think outside of their own box, to come up with ideas and agreements on how success can be brought by bringing different ideologies together. Out of that cluster, we were able to assist several businesses in sourcing new markets and perhaps adjusting the way they promote their products and or services, and also to find new clientele. We're really, really proud of what we've been able to achieve through the clustering grassroots methodology that we have adopted. This is one of the posters that we had from the prepared um, fundraising and donation drive where we put the shoes into the village, into Guyana. And this is a label for a product. Now, as Troy would have said initially, I am a public relations and communications professional by education, and for most of my life, I've been involved with communication. One of my skills is graphic design, and I use that skill while we are out on our trade mission to try to find people who are operating businesses, what we call cottage industries, who may not necessarily think of what they're doing as a business, but as just a way to help the family. And we're able to take what they're doing, have significant hours of meetings with them in order to take what they're doing from just something to make money. into a full-fledged company. Casey's Crunches is run by a lady in Guyana on the coast. She makes these really sweet, no candy. That's all you can explain. There's candy made from flour dough. I think there's different iterations of it all over the world. And she sells her product. And when we met with her, we were moved that her product tasted great, looked great, but didn't have any packaging that could stand on its own. And so we designed this label to go on a new packaging that we were able to take with her to local grocery stores. And she was able to get her line of candies into a major retail outlet there. Be proud of her. And then this, Kelvin's Taste. Kelvin is another young Guyanese we met. He's actually one of my good friends now. Initially, he was making something called casserie. And casserie is something like molasses, but it's made from cassava roots and it's used in Guyana's national dishes to make gravies and stews and their famous crepe pot. He was using recycled bottles with caps that he was getting from the local packaging company to make and sell his product. That recycled bottle he used to wash with soap and water and then a bleach solution and allow it to dry. He would use beer bottles, Coke bottles, whatever he could get his hands on in order to sell his product. When I met him, I asked him a series of questions and we decided he was one very worthy candidate for our energy. And so we worked with him to develop this label, but not just this one, several other products he's created since then. He created the label, got him to the packaging company, encouraged him to use new sanitary bottles that were not used before, and to package his product in a way that could reach the world. Kelvin's Taste made it to popular hotels locally where visitors to the country were able to purchase from the gift shops. And eventually, while we were there, landed his product in one of the major grocery chains in Guyana. Now his products are all there, and his name is becoming widely known as one of the best tasting um, Azure and other product manufacturers. We're very, very proud of what we've been able to accomplish, and it's with that that I want to open up for questions. There's a lot I have not said, but I just wanted you to see that community interventions don't always take on the perspective that one might imagine. And while we're battling the change in the climate and coming to terms with the fact that our lives will never be the same again, we're kind of a little bit happy that the climate decided to help us in ways that perhaps politicians couldn't, to end three creatures that really have kept the Caribbean back from progressing. And we're hoping that through tackling climate change, through education, through working together with all these interventions, that we'll be able to recreate the Caribbean. So it's not just a place where you will hear something like this, and you're probably gonna laugh when I play this. So the cliche, this is what you hear from the Caribbean. Yay! And the truth is we are feeling hot. We're feeling it. We're feeling the heat that is being caused by the change in the climate. And while the rest of the world says, yay, margaritas, pina coladas, we're going to be in the sun and sand, we're thinking, no, we can't afford it. We can't afford for it to get any hotter. Please, let's find ways, wherever you are, to work with your community, to not just tackle climate change, but perhaps to ask yourself, how can this change in climate do for our community what perhaps political will has never been introduced? How can it allow us to lobby for something that we may never have gotten if we were not now vulnerable because of the changing time. And I really hope that the conversation continues. I congratulate you for even embracing this topic and challenging yourself through various disciplines of study to see how perhaps we won't just change the world, but allow the changes that the earth is making to cause us perhaps to stop and to step back and to come again. Thank you so very much. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Nichole. For our audience members, if there's any questions, definitely feel free to put them in the chat. You know, Nichole, maybe you could comment a little more. I think, you know, when we think about, especially your point about subsistence living, and maybe this is just my bias, you know, yeah, there's, I think, a tendency maybe to equate that to, you know, poverty or something like that, as opposed to thinking about it as living in harmony with the world. And I think your points on that are just so poignant, and I think it's something that we could definitely learn from, right? Something to strive toward and think about. And I don't know if you have more comments along those lines,
I
but
sure,
I really
I
like
sure
that.
do. I sure do. Incidentally, we're good at our universities with coming up with new catchphrases that catch on. You know, we talk about where's your food coming from? You know, like how far has it traveled? We talk about the distance, and we create these really nice terms that we can write great essays with. You know, and sound really smart. At the end of the day, what we're really saying is we want food that's grown nearby. We want to make sure that it didn't travel halfway around the world and that they didn't pick it green and then have to spray it with chemicals so that it's right by the time they reach us, right? And the reality is, if we think about it and break it down, what we're really saying is that we need to return to a level of subsistence. It may not look the same way as a village in the interior close to the Amazon jungle, but in your community, let's say it's an urban community, who are your local farmers? Do you even know who they are? What are they growing? Are they growing organically? Or maybe they're using conventional methods to farm? Do you support them? Or do you prefer to just go into your mega store and pick up what you find there without asking questions? Subsistence can be looked at in different ways. Incidentally, I'm currently doing a course on post-harvest loss prevention through Coursera, the Canadian platform. Thankfully, our government in Barbados offered citizens who either became unemployed or whose businesses suffered due to COVID opportunities to get free education opportunities on this platform. So several people took the opportunity to go and get re-educated. Because I manufacture herbal teas and I'm a farmer, I grow quite a few of the herbs that go into my teas. I thought I needed to learn more about post-harvest loss and protecting crops. And one of the major things that caught my eye during this course of study is an examination of transportation. How much of the food produced in the world is actually lost because of the distance it has to travel, perhaps because of the inability of the transporters to carry it safely, to store it safely. And so then there's conversations about, are you willing to buy a wonky tomato? You know, are you willing to buy a pineapple that's maybe a little bit more yellow than green? The questions now become, what is the individual willing to do to participate in making sure that the new terms for subsistence, whatever they may be, are close and dear and discussed in a way that now you can say, we support our local farmers, hands down, whether they're urban farmers, and I'm not sure in Illinois um, just what the movement is in terms of urban agriculture. But then there's the freight farms where people are farming in containers and community gardens. I know Shania Gray, the church that she's at, she's in the counseling department. Shania's church was running a community garden. Um, and I actually saw that working myself while I was there in 2017. And I thought, oh, this is phenomenal. The members of the community all get to come and they do their part, pull weeds and help plant and to maintain the crops in the summer. And then they're able to share them and have their, block parties, whatever, and cook food using the tomatoes or whatever else they grew. And so really, the idea of subsistence has been frowned upon for several decades because you think, oh, people are really just making enough for themselves. It's not a business. It'll never grow. There's no business plan. There's really no way for them to really expand and perhaps become a big corporation. But that's the point. They don't want to expand and become a big corporation. They're happy with what they have. Sufficient is enough. And let's say you have a glut of peanuts, like the village that I adopted, Parashara village. They created a tiny peanut butter manufacturing plant. And when I say tiny, it's probably the size of your office, right? They had one machine, and that one machine ground those peanuts to pulp. And there they were able to manufacture 100% organic peanut butter, which I was working with them to help produce a label that they can sell across the country. But guess what? It's organic. It has 2 ingredients. And it's not going to be as popular as Jiffy or Smuckers or whatever else we know are the prominent brands. But they fell into an issue as they really usually farm for subsistence. They planted extra peanuts. And that year, they had a flood. And so the issue with encouraging people away from subsistence is that you want them to do more, to grow more, to be more like us. But then they could have used that extra space to plant a crop that would not have been so badly affected. And so while we were thinking, great, this is awesome, we're going to have an industry, they kind of ended up shooting themselves in the foot. And the next year, there was a drought and the wells ran dry, so they weren't able to grow peanuts after. That well has never filled up again until this year when there was a flood for 5 months. And so you see the challenges that we are facing with relation to.
Well, I think it's important when we think about, especially like the community gardens and growing our own food. It's not an all or nothing where we all have to necessarily be, growing all of our own food in our backyard, perhaps, right? But if we can do a little bit, it starts to make an impact when all of us are doing just a little bit better, a little bit more local. And so I think, yeah, those are fantastic points. We are probably getting close on time, and I want to be cognizant of your time because I'm so grateful. I don't know if there's any, I don't see any other comments in the chat. If there's any closing thoughts, and if not, it's okay. We can wrap up. But
Sure, I can definitely give closing thoughts. There's my thank you. What I'd like to say is that I know there are many people around the world who are fighting their fight on their own, and it's difficult to find other people who perhaps are being successful at what they're doing, and they may not consider themselves to be successful. Take me, for instance. I've achieved quite a lot over the 20 years that I've been fighting different causes and participating in community activities. But there came a point where I recognized that our societies have been taught that the one place that you can have the greatest impact is if you enter politics, active politics. And a lot of people who make great community leaders end up going into politics because someone has convinced them that when you enter the halls of the Senate or Congress or your local high office, that there you're going to be able to sign the papers that make the difference. But by the time you get there, you've been so harassed by lobby groups and by people who want to blackmail you and tell the whole world about your marijuana smoking past. And I mean, like, your life gets turned so upside down that you end up pandering to the people who perhaps fund your campaigns. And it's the same in the Caribbean. And so a lot of really great minds and community workers get absorbed into political systems. And then they lose their passion, they forget their foundation. And I mean, you see them maybe 10 years later, yes, they stood up in the halls of Parliament or Senate or whatever participated in signing legislation into place, but oftentimes they've lost touch. People who got them there and with the needs that they initially wanted to represent. And so my closing thoughts would be I had options, to perhaps go in those directions, but I made a choice. And I decided, if I have to be a member of a political party to make a difference, then I'm not going to do it. If I have to feel forced to join a specific movement in order for people to acknowledge my people, then I'm not going to be willing to do it. My voice in a democratic society should be enough. My voice should be the same voice as somebody from any other social um, strata that exists. And so what I did was to create space where there perhaps was none before. And I used my skills as a communications professional to let my voice be heard. I used my skills as a professional to allow children to let their voices be heard. And so in creating spaces, in forming organizations and groups, in working together with people with similar passions and reaching out across the globe, I'm comfortable now that without joining the political system, I've been able to be more effective over time than if I were stuck having to say yes to the bills that were passed or struggling to maintain, the cash that they pay at the end of the month. So I just want to encourage those of you who really are on here to perhaps think in your own community when you drive back or take the bus or train back home. When you look around, like, what's the challenge here? And if there's no challenge, just throw your hands up in the air, put feeling hot, hot, hot on your YouTube and just dance around your neighborhood. Just like, we're fantastic. There's nothing wrong with us. But perhaps think about what's happening in the community next door or maybe downtown. And just ask yourself, how can you, in your own small way, motivate children to perhaps be entrepreneurial, to re-educate, to join together, and to not give up. Even if the climate says we're going to slam you, we can find ways to say, no, no, climate, you're not going to slam us. You're going to help us.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your voice today and for your knowledge. And it's just such a eye-opening and fantastic discussion. So
Thank you so
thank
very
you
much.
very much. And we'll look for times down the road to
Look
bring you
forward to
back.
it.